Hello from Hiroshima, Japan. My name is Nasreen Azimi, and I am the co-founder and coordinator of Green Legacy Hiroshima. And I am speaking to you from Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park. My colleague Yuko Baba is now panning just before sunset. You can see the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the A-bomb dome, the atomic bomb dome. And further to the right, you can see the masterpiece of Kenzo Tange, the famed Japanese architect who designed this memorial museum and indeed the entire park on this north-south axis. The design is from 1949, so you can imagine what a masterpiece. It has not aged. And I think that it's a real honor and pleasure and also a moment of reflection for us whenever we host an event here by the Peace Memorial Park. And now this session, Conversations with Dr. Paul Smith of the Botanical Garden Conservation International, Secretary General of BGCI, is in its third reincarnation. Actually, initially, we were supposed to mark the 10th anniversary of the Green Legacy Hiroshima campaign that my friends and I have been conducting for the last 10 years. Then we thought maybe it would make sense to combine it with the August 6th memorial in Hiroshima, the memorial of the atomic bombing. And just as we were about to go forward with that, the events in Afghanistan started unfolding and affecting the 3 universities and botanical garden projects that we've been working on for the last 20 months. So we put our hearts and heads together and we decided to dedicate this session with Dr. Smith to botanical gardens, and botanical gardens not always in the easiest, richest, nicest, most peaceful places, but maybe also in times of difficulty and conflict. We named this session Conflict. We use the word conflict, but more in its Japanese sense, konran, which is confusion, dislocation, transition, and hopefully we are still very hopeful for our botanical garden campaign. Hopefully, this transition will allow us to continue this work that we have been privileged to do with 3 Afghan universities in Bamiyan, Kabul, and Paktia for the last 20 months. So without further ado, I would like to maybe start this session. We have many friends and colleagues from Japan, UK. I think we have no one from the US, and for understandable reasons, they're all sleeping for once. Maybe it's not a bad thing. But we also have colleagues joining us from Iran and Turkey, Italy. So I'm really very happy that we get this chance. And I wish to thank Paul for his generosity and for his ease and for his flexibility to change the topic and the conversation as events unfolded in Afghanistan. Paul Smith has been the Secretary General of Botanical Garden Conservation International, which is the largest grouping. It's the United Nations of Botanical Gardens, if I may so say. And he's the Secretary General since 2015. Before that, he was really involved for 9 years with the Millennium Seed campaign, which I think is something very dear to his heart, because he has also directed us to send the seeds of the A-bomb survivor trees that we have been campaigning with Green Legacy Hiroshima to the Millennium Seed Bank at the Kew Gardens. And before that, he's a field man. He worked in Africa for many years and working on various plant and ecosystem restoration. And so he has a sort of wide range, a very broad understanding of the issues that affect botanical gardens. And Paul, with your permission, I would like to go to The first question, which is maybe the broadest and most difficult question. We know the history of botanical gardens. When we started with this idea for Afghanistan, what troubled us and compelled us to move is that 33 countries in the world, the neediest countries for botanical garden expertise, don't have a single botanical garden. And around more than 40 countries just have one botanical garden. And if I just take the case of Afghanistan, which is a country the size of France, with altitudes going from a few hundred meters to 8,000 meters, I mean, the variety of ecosystems and plants is huge. One botanical garden will never be enough. So the first question to you, why are these institutions that are the closest plant-based institutions to people? They are not research labs only. They are not places of conservation only, but they are the face of the plant world towards people and the planet. They have a public mandate that many others don't have, because you don't walk into a Ministry of Agriculture to just wander and learn, but you do that for botanical gardens. So why such a shortage of botanical gardens where they are most needed? That would be my first question to you. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, and thank you, Nazreen, and it's a great pleasure to be here to talk about botanical gardens, which, as you say, are extremely important culturally, scientifically, in the way that they engage with people. You know, in fact, I might just share my screen and give a little bit of background on the Global Botanic Garden Network, and that might, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I'm going to save you about 3,000 words. And let me just quickly share my screen. So there are around 3,500 botanical organizations on our digital register of botanic gardens, and it's a broad term. It incorporates arboreta, so largely tree collections, botanical institutions, universities, and of course, many botanic gardens are associated with universities. We have about 700 botanic gardens in Europe, and most of them are associated with higher learning institutions. But it also includes forestry departments, forestry research institutes, some non-government organizations, and some community-based organizations. And I think that's something that I'll get on to, is what do we mean by a botanic garden? They occur in a wide range of habitats, diverse landscapes, which is important. Increasingly, they're involved in protected areas, and particularly those with high plant diversity. And they include world-class infrastructures, including indigenous plant nurseries, seed banks, and so on, labs. In fact, on the pictures there, the top right, that's Plant Bank in Australia. It is the largest, most diverse seed bank in the Southern Hemisphere. So we have really very sophisticated infrastructures and so on, because we're dealing with a whole array of plant diversity, not just a few crop species or a few forestry species, but 400,000 plant species which are out there. And of course, with that comes the expertise just within our network, which is a subset of those 3,500 botanic gardens. We estimate there are around 60,000 scientists, horticulturists, and educators who really have multiple disciplines to do with conserving and managing plant diversity, not just in botanic gardens and seed banks, but in the landscape. And I think, you know, you said this in your introduction, that one of the things that botanic gardens do is that they sit between research and practice. We have excellent research facilities, but we also have people who can grow plants. And we grow about 1/3 of all known plant diversity in the living collections of botanic gardens, and about 18,000 species of trees. So there's huge expertise there around how to conserve and manage plant diversity. But the big elephant in the room, as you've said, is the fact that botanic gardens do not exist where they're needed most. And this map shows that pretty clearly. You can see a huge concentration of botanic gardens in Europe and North America, increasingly in China and Southeast Asia, where there's a huge sort of push to to create new botanical gardens, and very much in the new mold as well, which is to do with development, it's to do with conservation of biodiversity. The old Western model of taxonomy, science, and so on is really now on its way out. We are much more involved, and the new models are to do with really dealing with the three crises, the global crises, to do with climate, to do with biodiversity loss, and poverty. And I think, although what we see here is, where we are at the moment, the encouraging news is that new generations of botanic gardens are being established, very much grounded in addressing those issues of climate change and particularly loss of biodiversity, solutions to poverty, and so on. So an example would be Toru Botanical Garden in Uganda, which is a relatively new garden in Fort Portal. It is set up entirely for restoring landscapes, particularly the watersheds of Uganda, and it's a hub for training on how to grow a much more diverse range of indigenous species, as well as exotic species for plantations. And that, it's also a lovely place to visit, and of course to have a picnic with the family. It has that public engagement element, but it has a very serious sort of training and capacity building role as well.
Thank you. If I may go back to this map that you just showed, I mean, many of the empty spaces were also spaces that are facing severe crisis, for example, food security. Afghanistan alone in 2018 and 2019, already the drought was so severe. And I have no idea how they were going to go forward with already this baggage on their shoulders of absence of food. So where do botanical gardens sit with regard to the knowledge related to food security? I think even before, I mean, they are obviously all connected, but first of all, people need to feed themselves. And if the ecosystem is collapsing, how would they know how to restore it?
Yeah, and you're touching on really a perfect storm of issues. We have changing climate, so we're seeing increasing drought around the world. We've got poverty. People have not got access to crops that really enable them to adapt. So botanic gardens have a really important role there. And without going too much into the technical detail on this, really one of the best options that we have for adaptation to food security is developing new crop varieties that are resistant to drought, resistant to pests and diseases, which is another unfortunate consequence of changing climate, and also the fact that we spread them around. These are sort of man-made problems. So crop wild relatives are mainly held in the world's botanic gardens. They have traits which we have bred out of our mainstream crops, including resistance to drought, as I say, and so on. So what plant breeders need to do is to go back to those wild progenitors of our crops and breed back in the useful traits. There's a couple of things that you need there. The first is to know which are the most closely related crop species, and that's where taxonomy comes in, and the science that botanic gardens have led really over the last century, well, 2 centuries really, since Linnaeus. So understanding which are your most closely related crop species, and then the material itself to breed in these useful traits. So when I was at the Millennium Seed Bank, we worked very closely with the Global Crop Diversity Trust on an Adapting Agriculture to Climate Change project. And they were able to bring in the mainstream cultivars and crops. We were able to bring in the crop wild relatives. And we asked actually PricewaterhouseCoopers PwC to give us a value of new traits for crops. And we wanted a dollar value because we had managed to persuade the Norwegian government to cough up $50 million for this program. And what we had discovered was that for our main crops, wheat, rice, maize, potatoes, and so on, that 50% of those crop wild relatives that are still there in nature were not available to crop breeders. So the project was about getting those crops into our seed bank so that they're available to breeders. So the Norwegian government kindly funded this at $50 million. But we wanted to know, what is the return on that investment? What is the value of those crop wild relatives? So of course, we got a consultancy finance firm to look at it. And the figure they came up with, without taking into account adaptation to climate change, was $42 billion, basically. That is the value of those resilience traits. So that looked like very good value indeed. And in fact, the project has just finished, and we've been able to make a much wider range of crop diversity available to crop breeders. This is one reason why it is essential that botanic gardens are grounded in science, and particularly in multidisciplinary science. It's why it makes sense that they are associated with universities where those disciplines come together. And one of the things that we are actively engaged with at BGCI, and in fact, I'll be giving a presentation next week on this to our International Advisory Council, which is the represents essentially the whole botanical community, is a new plant material exchange platform that will be compatible with mainstream forestry and with agriculture, so that we can start to exchange material routinely, adhering to access and benefit sharing under the CBD, adhering to biosafety, biosecurity rules, CITES, and so on. So we're very excited about that as a practical development that will enable our community, who, as I say, cultivate a third of all known plant diversity, to share that material with the crop research and forestry research community.
Thank you. I think this idea that we have the perfect storm of problems, but at the same time, we have tools now that we could not even imagine 20, 30, 50 years ago. So I think it's about the bigger question of how does science serve humanity? And I think, again, botanical gardens are really well placed to practice it and to put it at the use of people, which maybe others do not see the same kind of pressure. So I want to continue on this and talk about maybe an inventory that is very dear to your heart, because I think it just came out recently, which is the Global Tree Assessment. And obviously, here we have a particular affection for that, because for the last 10 years, we've seen what even 160 survivor trees can do. Guide us through, what does this Global Tree Assessment mean? Why is it so important? And where do we go from here? And how do you see botanical gardens leading this campaign?
Okay, let me share my screen again, and we can talk a little bit about trees, which, as you say, are very dear to my heart. Yes, we have these sort of combined crises, if you like, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and poverty, and they are all absolutely interrelated. We're burning fossil fuels and fueling the climate crisis because people are poor and we don't have other alternatives. We're cutting down the forests for the same reason. It's important that we tackle these holistically. Unfortunately, the policy landscape at the moment is not particularly conducive to that. And I think this is where we do have an important role. As I say, we have a sort of multidisciplinary approach with this. We're very much involved with the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also the Climate Change Convention and the various other biodiversity-related conventions which are out there. One of our concerns has been that tree planting for carbon and livelihoods can actually have a negative impact on biodiversity. And if you take the Bond Challenge, for example, which is a laudable initiative, make no mistake, you know, we all agree we need to put trees into the landscape. We've got nearly 300 million hectares of pledges now for afforestation. But one of the issues there is that almost half of that pledged area, and probably more actually in practice, is set to become plantations of commercial trees. Now, there are 60,000 roughly species of tree out there in the wild. We grow a few hundred at most through forestry and for plantation, which is the reason, you know, you'll see eucalyptus everywhere, you'll see Australian acacias, you'll see several pine species. In the north here, we grow Sitka spruce, which is, you know, from the west coast of America. We select them because they grow fast, they grow straight, and they have useful traits for production. That doesn't make them the best options for sequestering carbon, nor the best options for biodiversity. So the big challenge here is that we could potentially be creating even more sterile landscapes in our efforts to put carbon into the ground. And one of the things that we've been doing is leading this global tree assessment, which, amongst other things, is a scorecard, if you like, for each country around the world, looking at the number of native tree species that they have, the number of endemic tree species, so those tree species which only occur in those countries, how many of those are threatened, and then how many of them are conserved either in seed banks and botanic gardens, or more importantly, in a protected area somewhere. And this kind of information is extremely important for policymakers, because it's saying, you know, if you are the government of Chile, that you have 23 of your tree species are not protected anywhere. And, you know, what are you going to do about that? And that gives us the opportunity also to work with INEA, with our partner in Chile, which is a government organization, to say, you know, let's work together and make sure that these species are conserved both in the wild and also as a backup in seed banks or in botanic gardens. So that's one big advantage. What the Global Tree Assessment is also showing us is that we have around 17,500 tree species threatened with extinction. 440 are right on the brink of extinction. There are fewer than 50 individuals in the wild left. And perhaps one of the most famous is this Hyophobia maricolis in Mauritius, which is just a single tree. It's called the loneliest tree in the world. It's 150 years old. It has a cage around it now because it's in danger of falling down. Like all of us who get old, we need propping up. And it's also not looking that well. I visited it back in 2019 and took this picture. So far, we've not been able to propagate this tree. Various botanic gardens are trying to do that now before it's too late. And we do have examples, really great examples of success stories, including Café Marron from nearby Rodrigues, which was down to a single tree and is now happily back in the wild and doing very well. It was propagated in botanic gardens over a period of 30 years and has been reintroduced into Grand Montaigne National Park in Rodrigues. So it is possible to bring these trees back from the brink of extinction, but we need to get organized. There's a maple there from Japan. We've got other Japanese species which, ironically, are threatened by tree planting and plantation tree planting, including Japanese endemics. I think one of them is Pseudotsuga japonica. So this is going to be up to governments. It's going to be up to civil society to make sure that we find room for these species in our landscapes. And bear in mind that we have transformed at least 50% of the ice-free terrestrial landscape for human use, for agriculture, for forestry, for urban conurbations, and so on. We have to find room for biodiversity. There's some other things to say about trees. I think they're culturally extremely important, and that is nowhere better epitomized than through Green Legacy Hiroshima. Those trees have terrific cultural importance. And so working with local communities who get that is fundamental to this. It's not something we can just leave to governments. And the great thing about botanic gardens is that they are generally grounded in their communities. 750 million people visit botanic gardens each year. That's not the same for other technical institutions like forestry institutes or crop institutes and so on. We have the opportunity to not also just wait for visitors to come to us, but to work proactively with communities where these trees are, or whatever the plants are, and work with those communities to nurture them and make sure that they're not lost. The other thing to say is that it's not just about us. The loss of a single tree species is a complete tragedy for thousands of other species, insects, mammals, birds, and so on. And we often use the example here of the English oak, Quercus robur. There are 2,300 other species rely on that oak tree in their life cycles. You lose the oak, you lose them as well. There's a knock-on effect. So, I think raising awareness about this, bringing in the cultural element is exceedingly important to that public engagement role that we can play. And bringing civil society to bear as well. We do a lot of training of communities and so on with some of the technical skills needed. But really there's this opportunity. And when it comes to planting trees, if you look at Ethiopia, for example, and I went out to do a study in January before lockdown last year, looking at their capacity for tree planting. 613 indigenous tree species in Ethiopia, but currently available from their tree seed centers, only 34 of those, so 5%. Most are exotic species, mainly from Australia. So when you look at actually the numbers of seeds being produced by the National Tree Seed Centers for the 22 million hectares that Ethiopia has pledged to restore, you've got 2.28 billion seeds of 18 exotic species compared to 285 million seeds of indigenous species. So clearly there's a massive disjunct between our desire to restore natural habitats and our capacity to do so. And again, this is where botanic gardens can come in. We can train people, we have resources, we know how to grow a wide range of species and so on. Country level assessment data I've mentioned. So let me stop sharing there before we get on to social benefits. But that gives you an example, I think, of how we can influence policy, but also how we can influence practice, by bringing in communities, by imparting skills, and so on.
Thank you. For maybe the last question or reflection, and I'm curious to know what you think is, doctors have Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, Architects Without Borders. I think a lot of disciplines have rallied to extend expertise. In other words, I have always worked for an institution, UNITAR, the main objective of which is to make it a level playing field as much as possible, without obviously losing the idea that it's going to be maybe impossible, but always tending towards that. So my last question to you is, Botanical Gardens Without Borders, what can we do for Afghanistan and countries like Afghanistan, Ethiopia, you just mentioned, Syria, Iraq, countries where there's enormous pressure, so many complications and difficulties. Can we do anything to help their experts and their communities, even from afar? Do we have that kind of flexibility? How do we build that strength to not just drop and move to another safer place? Because this is our world. It's Afghanistan is part of our world. We cannot turn our gaze away. So during this time of confusion, conflict, and conran, is there anything we can do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one thing that we're absolutely committed to is building regional capacity, as well as sort of global interactions where required. Different regions have got different cultural drivers. They have different sets of problems and ways to address those. There's language, there's all of those elements. So one thing that we have been supporting over the last number of years has been setting up regional associations of botanic gardens. In some countries, those already exist, and they may be sort of national networks. India, for example, has a large national network of botanic gardens. But we've set up, for example, the Southeast Asian Botanic Garden Network. I think next is likely to be South Asia. We're just in the process of setting up a South American network. There's already a Caribbean and Central American network, as well as, of course, the old European network and Australia and New Zealand and so on. And I think where BGCI can help with that is not only, so we provide the secretariats for many of these regional associations. And where we can help is by providing, so people are not reinventing wheels, by providing training, and there we can bring in global expertise by providing partnership. So we run a partnership program where botanic gardens can twin with each other, supporting these regional networks in their own languages, providing, as I say, resources and translation services, so that people are not having to start from scratch. And Nazreen, you'll know, of course, about our Botanic Garden Manual, which we're steadily translating into various languages now, which is really, decades, if not longer, of learning about how to set up and manage a botanic garden. And also bringing in the modern aspects. It's really important, as I say, that we create these gardens and we support these gardens in the way that they are engaged with national and regional priorities, and particularly, as I say, dealing with these crises related to climate, loss of biodiversity, human livelihoods, and so on. So the great thing about botanical community is, and I say this hand on heart, is that we are a sharing community. There is very, very little sort of in the way of jealousy or any of the sort of the worst aspects of that you sometimes find in other disciplines and so on. I think what you said earlier, people who work with plants generally are very gentle people, and it's one of the reasons that I love working in this sector, because people who love plants are great. They may not be the best communicators with the rest of society, but they're great at communicating with each other, and they're great at communicating with plants. And there is a real camaraderie, as we're seeing, I think, with the Afghanistan situation, where, as you'll be aware, that the global community is trying to find places for Afghans who have horticultural skills and so on within the broader botanic garden community. So that work is ongoing at the moment. So I'm really optimistic in that sense. But I do feel, as I say, that this cannot be top down. It needs to be grounded in the regions themselves. And there are regions, and particularly I would say West Asia, where there's been so much conflict over recent years that we need to build that capacity, I think, within the region. So it's driven from within, but with support from the global community. And again, we've been in early discussions about that with the Royal Botanic Gardens Jordan, actually. Princess Basma is on our board, about how we can start to get that underway. And I think, that once we've got those infrastructures in place, then we have the opportunity, as I say, to really bring to bear what the global community can bring in terms of support. So that's our plan. And we have a 5-year strategy with BGCI, which has just started. And the main thrust of that capacity is to build regional networks and centers of expertise within those regions, and then support botanic gardens that way. We have other mechanisms, including the Global Botanic Garden Fund, which is specifically for small gardens in biodiverse areas and so on, where we're providing financial support. But the main thing is going to be to set up these infrastructures and hopefully bring in that local expertise and knowledge combined with global support.
Thank you. Thank you. I can personally vouch for the generosity and gentleness of botanical garden experts. Many of the greats like Peter Raven, Ari Novi from San Diego Botanic Garden, your colleagues at BGCI, Sarada Krishnan at Denver Botanic Gardens, all these people joined our advisory board for Afghanistan Botanic Gardens, pro bono, obviously, all of them busy people, and they have been extraordinarily committed. So there is a real camaraderie that I also have not easily seen in other disciplines and other settings. I think that is a real strength. It's maybe a bit like musicians, the people who love plants, they don't really need different languages. They have a common language. And I think there is a lot of potential there. So thank you. I would like to maybe ask the participants if they have questions to send it to chat, and Yuko and I will try and sort that out. But before that, I would like to turn to my good friend, a member of the Botanical Garden Network Committee, really a guide for many of us, a pillar in everything that is worth doing, President Monte Kassim, president of the Akita International University. He was previously with president of Shizenkan University in Tokyo, and for many years, one of the first non-Japanese to be president of a Japanese university at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University. We've all learned so much from Monty, and I have to say, personally, I confess, we would not have dared start this campaign in Afghanistan was it not for his absolute pushing us to take the leap, because it was worth doing. Thank you, Monty John, and you have the floor for about 10 minutes.
So starting with that, Paul, there's so much content in what you said that 10 minutes is not enough, I think, but let me try. There are two things that struck me very much. One, of course, is to take botanical gardens beyond just the old model. And I think that is so relevant today. Because nature is transdisciplinary, nature is integrative, nature is coherent. Why do we put things in silos, And that, I think, was at the root of what you said. One of the places that in my career, before I did all those things that Nasreen talked about, was to be a field scientist for about a quarter of a century. And one of the places that I learned a lot was in a place called Sabah, and particularly from the Sabah Foundation, which manages 1 million hectares of forest lands. But where did they learn how to manage these 1 million hectares properly? And I think that is where what Paul said resonates with me. They decided to look at the pristine rainforest, which has been untouched by man, as a learning crucible for working out how to deal with managed forests. And they did it together with the Royal Society. There were others of us from Japan who were involved. But over the years, we realized that nature has no borders either, just like the botanical gardens would have no borders if Nasreen had her way. So it is very, very important to understand this integrative aspect of plants. And plants are the basis on which all of us hang off, They are the ones who sequester energy through carbon capture from the sun's energy. They are the ones on whom all of us life forms are dependent. So the Dunham Valley Field Center in this 1 million hectares is about 40,000 hectares of pristine forest, which was used as a learning place. While this was happening, another 35,000 hectares were discovered in Maliao Basin. Malia Basin is even more pristine than the Danube Valley. And Malia Basin, unfortunately, had a concession given to an Australian mining company to mine coal, which was directly under the basin. But the prince, a man a bit like Nasreen, undeterred, Tun Adlin, he persuaded the then Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad that 16 years of coal deposits given to an Australian concession will earn nothing after 16 years. It will probably need a lot of investment to restore the land. But if you kept the biodiversity, it could become a crucible of learning. It could be a place by which you could have managed ecotourism. You could have all kinds of things, and it would go on in perpetuity. And I think that is, in a sense, what this Botanical Gardens Without Borders can do. It can help us see a way towards living, earning, and enjoying nature in perpetuity. And that, I think, was one of the important things that I got from Paul's talk. The second one relates to the topic that we've taken on today, in times of conflict and beyond, and Afghanistan, which we started with 18 months ago, is the case that is right now extremely topical, troublesome, but something has to be done. So how does one do it? And for me, there are some lessons I learned from my own country, Sri Lanka, which also had about 3 decades of sadness, not too dissimilar to Afghanistan. But in these times of sadness, it was not with trees and botanical gardens, but we did it with tools. My wife and some friends of mine and I started in 1993 a small non-profit organization which is still going on today. It's called Tools for Self-Reliance Japan. It is modeled on the UK Tools for Self-Reliance, but unlike the UK model, the Japanese one could only send about 1,000 tools as opposed to the 40,000 tools that are sent from the UK. And the UK sends mainly to Africa. So we decided to make Asia our scope of activity. And from this, we decided to see what we can do next. Now, what we did was we send only 1,000 tools, but we send a group of artisans with the tools who teach the most impoverished communities how to do something with those tools that would make them self-reliant. And the result was small power plants, hydroelectric plants, wind plants. And there is a video I've sent Nasreen a link, and I'll send you the link too, Paul. Please have a look at it. You'll see what this organization did in Sri Lanka. Now, what it did in Sri Lanka has gone on to Bhutan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Thailand, India, and the Philippines. So I think sending the tools and the artisans who have the traditional know-how was the key. And I think there is a parallel in this for botanical gardens. What was very interesting was that even in the height of the Sri Lankan conflict, despite the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan giving advisories not to travel to Sri Lanka, these tens of artisans who were around Tools for Self-Reliance said they would go, and they went twice a year, every year, for 2 weeks each time. And through this, they were able to change lives and livelihoods. We've had conflicts with various within community things, which were resolved by the fact that the tool was neutral. We've had what we might call dialogues with the then hostile elements in society who blew up a power plant or a water purification system or whatever it is, who wanted it rebuilt. And the tool and the technology behind it became the neutral venue for dialogue between otherwise hostile elements. So I think Botanical Gardens Beyond Borders can be also that neutral element, but we have to bide our time a little bit, make sure that we are resilient as an organization, so that when the time is right, we can engage with whoever who holds the reins of power in Afghanistan to serve its people. And that is the bigger mandate, I think. And that is a lesson I learned from Tools for Self-Reliance Japan, which could be used for Afghanistan's Botanical Garden Network. Once again, we use universities because universities are not very, what you might call in a businessman's way of thinking, productive, but they are extremely resilient and long-lasting, just like the Botanical Gardens Network that Paul, you and your friends have created. So I think hosting these activities in a resilient place is very good. And it was a small non-profit organization which has lasted now for 29 years. It has shown that it can survive. And everyone is a volunteer, is an unpaid volunteer. So despite the Foreign Ministry's advisory, these people went. As a result, they were able to bridge communities, hostile elements, and the powers that be in the country together. They were extremely neutral in what they did, but they served the people. And whether you're a guerrilla, whether you're a government, serving the people is something that you want to do as well. And if you can use this activity to serve people, it's a win-win game. So I think we have to be careful, bide our time, be sensitive, and fortunately, botanists are gentle people. And a place like Afghanistan now needs that gentleness. We need a whole swathe of clothes which are gentle, warm, soft to the skin, and all embracing, that will bring Afghanistan out of this. And I think the Botanical Gardens Network and plants as a starting point is that neutral element which can make this change. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Monty, as always, inspiring us. I have quite a number of questions here for Paul. Paul, if I may, I will quickly run through them. I don't know if you can see them. We have from Liz Lee. What do you think of the genetically modified foods, seeds versus the wild seeds and crops? I think that's a recurrent question and concerns everyone. So your opinion will be very important. From Professor Mahichi at Asia Pacific University. She's also a member of Eden. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Every species has cultural, ecological, and economical services and values, so as to highlight what we will be losing in case of extinction of species. Are there maps at local, national, global levels indicating the economic loss of such threatened species? I think what you indicated in terms of actually costing, the cost and benefit, I think how realistic is it? Can we have that more frequently, more easily at the local and national levels as well? And from Alireza Narinejad from Iran, we have, thank you, Paul, for your presentation. You showed the Nature paper indicating number of planted trees are increasing in making carbon. There has been increasing interest among public nowadays to plant indigenous trees versus the exotic ones. What do you think about public campaigns on distribution and expanding of native trees and shrubs? And what help can botanical gardens bring to preserve these native plants? Maybe we can stop here and see how time goes. Over to you, Paul.
The GM question first. Yes, we get that a lot. When I talk about crop breeding, I'm talking about traditional breeding. Not transgenic techniques, cisgenic techniques, traditional crop breeding, and that's why you're looking for crop wild relatives which are closely related. It's an interesting one, GM, because you know, as a scientist, we sort of try to follow the scientific advice on this, and of course, human health is important, so is ecological health. But the argument that we would make is that we have barely scratched the surface with what nature gives us. It was interesting. I was in a meeting. You probably won't believe this, but I was in a meeting in Shenzhen in China, a few years back at the International Botanical Congress, actually. And I had a question from a Chinese student who was from the Beijing Genomics Institute. And she said, why do we need all of these species? She said, when we can just make species that we need. And that was very much a biotechnology view. And my answer to that was, well, first of all, we can't just make species, not from scratch, not from base pair up. We're relying on nature for genes and alleles, and we build those up, even using these sort of transgenic techniques. So, you know, if we let species become extinct, then with their extinction, we lose the possibility of those useful traits. Secondly, what does that say about us if we think that we can throw away what nature has given us and then just make what we need from what is left? You know, I think that's not just a spiritual question or a moral question. It also is grounded in the fact that we are part of the ecology of this planet. You know, we're custodians, and we have an important role as custodians. If we just pursue a sort of selfish, we can make it for ourselves approach and philosophy, then we're doomed, frankly. So going back to the GM thing, you know, we need nature, and nature has given us the tools. Let's use those. That would be our starting point in that debate. Around economic loss and so on, what the State of the World's Trees report shows is that 1 in 5 of those threatened tree species has direct benefits to people. And I'm not talking about cutting down for firewood, I'm talking about medicines, foods, and so on. So there's no question that you know, there are economic effects in losing these species. And it was interesting listening to Monty talking about Southeast Asia. I mean, dipterocarps are a case in point in the timber industry there. You know, we don't replenish these resources, these tropical hardwoods. And I think there's around 200 different dipterocarp species. We grow about 70 of them, and almost none of them at scale. So we're not replenishing those hardwoods, which have, you know, billions of dollars. I think it's $400 billion a year, the hardwood timber industry. And if we're not replenishing them and planting them because it takes too long, then, you know, we're going to be in trouble down the line. In fact, you know, we're already finding that. So, you know, it's really important, therefore, that we do take into account these economic questions. But again, I would say it's not just about economics, and there's only so far that you can go with the direct use argument. I think much more important there is the way that nature hangs together as a whole. Trees are keystone species. You take away that keystone and you can get a cascade effect that will affect ecosystem services, pollinators, oxygen, carbon capture, all of those things, erosion control, a whole range of other services that nature provides. So our view is we need to keep, conserve, manage as much biodiversity as possible, not just the ones that are useful to people. So the final question was about indigenous tree species and helping communities. And yes, absolutely. And, you know, this is the essence of Botanic Gardens Without Borders. So I'll give you a couple of examples, both driven by local communities. One is Malawi in Africa. Malawi's national tree is Witheringtonia whitey. It's the Mulanje cedar. Tremendously valuable. You know, it's termite resistant, it's rot resistant. It $4,000 a cubic meter, but it only grows on a single mountain in Malawi. And the local people around the mountain were convinced that it was not possible to grow this tree, that God put it there, God grows the tree. So because they're very poor, they cut down this tree, and there was virtually nothing left on the mountain. We knew that you could grow this species, and so we set up 10 community nurseries with support from the international community. And they are now putting about 500,000 seedlings a year that they're growing, and those are going back onto the mountain. So the people are benefiting from selling the seedlings, and also from planting the seedlings, and that means that they will be there for future generations. But there was a single technical issue. So when people had tried to grow it before, they had been putting them in the plastic bags. It sends down a taproot. And I mean, this sounds really basic, but what people were doing when they were transplanting it was just to cut the taproot off with a machete and carry it up the mountain, and then wonder why it didn't establish. So our conifer expert, who came out actually from the UK, he just said, right, no, you need to grow them on tables so that they can't stick a taproot into the ground. You know, hey presto, we had sort of a 90% survival back on the mountain. So small technical interventions like that can help. One, and I must be quick, I know. One second example, because Monty mentioned Bhutan. We were contacted by a community in the Dangchu Valley in Bhutan who wanted to grow another Cupressus kashmiriana, which is used in monasteries, in dzongs in Bhutan. And they had a big grove of those, I think the biggest in Bhutan. The government was taking them to build monasteries, but the local people had no control over that. No, they didn't own those trees because nature has provided those trees. So they said, we want to grow our own trees so that they're there for future generations. If you help us to set up nurseries and to plant those trees, they will belong to us. We have 13 hectares available. So they needed help with getting seed, and we sent some international expertise to help with that, climbing these 50-meter trees to get seed from the top, and set up a nursery with capacity for 20,000 trees a year, which the community has now planted, and they own those trees. And we said to them, when do you think you'll be able to harvest them? And they said, well, maybe in 85 years' time. So they weren't thinking about themselves. They were thinking about not even their grandchildren or great-grandchildren. They were thinking for the future. And those trees are culturally important to them. And again, there were sort of just some technical areas that we could help.
To conclude, I will thank our two speakers, Paul and Monty, and I also want to thank the Eden Seminar Network team who have backed us up. And with your permission, I would like to just read two quotes, being in Japan, one from Japan, from Basho, who is the most iconic haiku poet of Japan of the 17th century, and the other one from my own country of birth. Basho says in a very short poem, go to the pine if you want to learn about the pine, and go to the bamboo if you want to learn about the bamboo. And I think this can be a motto for botanical gardens. And this panel is a quote, I often use it because it touches us humans so deeply. It's a panel at Japan's Miho Museum by Khosrow Anushiravan, who was a king of the Sassanid period, 6th century. And he has written this as his pledge to life and to the planet. I have sought the course of action most pleasing to God, and have found that it consists in that whereby sky and earth continue to exist, the mountains remain immovable, the rivers flow, and the earth is kept pure. Thank you, everyone.